Robbie Coltrane spent decades making audiences feel something real. That was the whole job, and he never stopped doing it. Amy Winehouse recorded 5 songs for Back to Black and changed what a pop album could sound like. The legacy was sealed before she ever knew what it would become. Shelley Duvall showed up on screen and made you believe every second. Gilbert Gottfried understood that comedy is commitment. You pick a lane and you go all the way down it. No apologies. Bob Saget built a career on being 2 things at once: the wholesome face on the poster and the sharpest, most subversive comedian in the room. Bob Marley made music that outlived every chart it ever appeared on. That is not influence. That is permanence. There is a version of Jennifer Aniston the world agreed on early and never fully let go of. Sun-streaked hair, the girl next door with perfect comedic timing. America's sweetheart in a Manhattan apartment that no New Yorker could actually afford. That image was real enough, but it was also a surface, and what built the career underneath it was something the image never quite captured: an almost obsessive precision about craft, a ferocious work ethic, and a willingness to absorb public punishment for decades without flinching. Start with the thing that actually changed television. When Friends debuted in September 1994, ensemble sitcoms existed, but few had cracked the problem of making 6 leads feel equally essential. By the time the show hit its stride in seasons 3 and 4, Aniston's Rachel Green had become the gravitational center of the ensemble. Not because the writing always gave her the most to do, but because Aniston had developed a kind of reactive intelligence on camera that made every scene she was in feel sharper. Other performers in the cast have spoken about this directly. Lisa Kudrow, in multiple interviews, described Aniston as someone who raised the stakes in a scene simply by being present and fully committed. Courtney Cox has said similarly that Aniston's instincts in rehearsal consistently sharpened the group's work. This is not vague praise. It is testimony from collaborators about a specific effect she had on the room. The numbers attached to Friends are staggering, but they are also almost too large to feel real, so it is worth anchoring them in specifics. By season 9, Jennifer Aniston and her 5 co-stars were each earning $1 million per episode, a negotiating landmark that restructured how networks approached ensemble cast deals for the next 2 decades. They negotiated as a unit. That move, which required all 6 to trust each other and hold a collective line against one of the most powerful studios in television, was unprecedented at the time and has since been cited by entertainment lawyers and industry analysts as the moment ensemble cast bargaining permanently changed. The show itself ran for 10 seasons, produced 236 episodes, and in syndication has never stopped airing. In 2023, nearly 20 years after the finale, Friends remained one of the most streamed library titles on any platform carrying it. That is not nostalgia, that is durability. But here is the thing about that image: the hair, the warmth, the approachability. It came with a cost that was being paid privately the entire time the public was enjoying it. By the late 1990s, Jennifer Aniston was not just famous. She was a specific kind of famous that collapses the distance between a person and a character. Rachel Green was aspirational but relatable. Aniston, by extension, was supposed to be that too: open, available, uncomplicated. The press treated her accordingly. Coverage of her personal life, particularly her marriage to Brad Pitt, beginning in 2000, was relentless in a way that the tabloid industry of that era normalized, but that, viewed from the present, looks like sustained intrusion. When that marriage ended in 2005, the coverage did not simply report a divorce. It constructed a narrative about a woman who had been abandoned, who was perhaps not enough, who had chosen career over family and paid for it. That narrative was built almost entirely without her participation, using sources she has since described as fabricated or grotesquely misrepresented. What is remarkable is what she did with it, or more precisely, what she refused to do with it. She did not give the breakdown interview. She did not stage a redemption arc through carefully managed press access. She made movies. Between 2005 and 2012, she appeared in film after film. Along Came Polly, Derailed, The Breakup, Marley and Me, He's Just Not That Into You, The Switch, Horrible Bosses, Wanderlust, producing a body of work that critics routinely undervalued because the tabloid narrative about her life had infected the critical lens. Reviews of her films in that period frequently mentioned her personal life in the opening paragraph. Male leads in the same films were reviewed as actors. This double standard was documented, discussed by film critics themselves, and eventually contributed to a broader industry conversation about how celebrity coverage shapes critical reception for women. The Breakup deserves specific attention because it is the film that most directly captures the gap between the image she was carrying and the performance she was actually giving. Released in 2006, the film subverted its own romantic comedy marketing. The poster suggested resolution. The movie did not deliver one. And Aniston's performance as Brooke, a woman who demands to be seen by a partner who has stopped looking, was a piece of sustained emotional precision that the critical establishment mostly dismissed, while audiences made it a genuine hit. It grossed over $200 million worldwide, on a production budget of roughly $52 million. The film has since been reconsidered by a number of critics who have revisited it through a post-2010s lens and found something substantially more honest and formally interesting than the original reviews suggested. That reappraisal is itself a form of documented cultural impact. In 2014, something shifted, not in her, but in how the industry was willing to see her. Cake arrived, and with it, a Jennifer Aniston performance that stripped away almost every element of the public image that had been both her commercial asset and her critical liability. No flattering cinematography, no charm deployed as armor. She played Claire, a woman in chronic pain, navigating grief, addiction, and anger, physically transformed for the role, working in a register that had almost nothing to do with Rachel Green or any of the romantic comedies that preceded it. The Golden Globe nomination that followed was the industry acknowledging formally what collaborators had been saying informally for years. The Oscar nomination did not follow, and that omission became a flashpoint. Journalists, critics, and other filmmakers expressed open frustration. The Academy's failure to nominate her for Cake is now routinely cited in pieces about the Academy's historical blind spots regarding comedic and television performers who transition to dramatic work. She did not stop. The Morning Show, which premiered on Apple TV Plus in 2019, produced one of the most consequential performances of her career, precisely because it arrived at the intersection of the Me Too reckoning and the era of prestige streaming drama. And Aniston was not a supporting player or a legacy casting choice. She was the engine. As Alex Levy, a morning television anchor, navigating the exposure of her co-host and the collapse of her own carefully maintained public persona, Aniston was playing, and this is the detail that made critics pay attention, a character whose entire professional existence depended on managing the gap between image and reality. The parallel was not subtle, but Aniston executed it with enough specificity and control that it transcended any biographical reading. She won the Screen Actors Guild Award for Outstanding Performance by a Female Actor in a Drama Series for the role. That is the industry's peers voting, not a committee. It is one of the more meaningful metrics available. The morning show also demonstrated something about her business instincts that the acting coverage tends to overshadow. Aniston is a producer on the series, not as a courtesy credit, but as a working producer who was involved in development and creative decisions. Her production company, Echo Films, which she founded, has been the vehicle for several of her film projects over the years. The move into production and the decision to go to Apple TV Plus with the morning show, rather than taking a traditional network deal, was a calculated bet on where prestige was migrating in the industry. It paid off in visibility, critical recognition, and positioning. She made that bet herself. There is also the business dimension that rarely receives the serious analysis it deserves. Aniston's partnership with the haircare brand Living Proof, in which she was not simply an endorser but an equity stakeholder, was a model for celebrity business involvement that predated the current wave of celebrity-founded or celebrity equity consumer brands by several years. She was an early mover in treating brand partnership as ownership rather than advertising. Living Proof was acquired by Unilever in 2016, in a deal reported at over $150 million. Her involvement with Vital Proteins, Smart Water, and other brands has followed a similar pattern of selective alignment with products she has publicly described as part of her actual life, rather than paid adjacency. Whether one finds the wellness industry compelling or not, the commercial architecture she has built around her public identity is sophisticated, durable, and widely studied in brand partnership circles. What the public image obscured for a long time was the degree to which the warmth and accessibility that made her commercially viable were also functioning as a kind of camouflage. The friendliness read as ease, the ease read as effortlessness, and effortlessness, in the particular cultural logic that governs how women's work is perceived, reads as not quite serious. The discipline underneath, the physical preparation, the script development, the producer meetings, the business negotiations, the decades of consistent output, was invisible precisely because the image was working so well. She has spoken about this directly in interviews more openly in recent years than in the decades when the tabloid cycle was at its most aggressive. In a 2022 interview with The Hollywood Reporter, she described the period after her divorce as one in which she made a deliberate choice to protect her private life, not out of shame or retreat, but out of a principled refusal to feed a machine that had already demonstrated it would distort whatever it was given. That framing, strategic privacy as a form of agency rather than avoidance, recontextualizes a decade of coverage that was frequently written as evidence of woundedness or mystery. She was not hiding, she was managing. The friends who have spoken about her on the record, Courtney Cox, Jimmy Kimmel, Chelsea Handler, Jason Bateman, among others, describe a consistency of character that is itself unusual in an industry famous for performing friendship. Bateman, who co-starred with her in Horrible Bosses and The Switch, has described in interviews the experience of working with someone whose professionalism was absolute and whose humor was completely unperformed. These are specific, named accounts from people with no incentive to manufacture mythology. The question of legacy, for someone who is still working, still producing, still visible, is necessarily incomplete. But some things are already settled. The ensemble negotiating model she helped establish changed how television contracts are structured. The critical reappraisal of her dramatic work changed how the industry thinks about the ceiling for performers who built their reputation in comedy. The morning show demonstrated that a streaming platform could launch with a prestige drama anchored by a performer whose primary association was a network sitcom that ended 15 years earlier, and that the audience would follow. Her business moves in brand equity and production have been quietly influential in ways that have not received the same attention as her acting, but that are documented and real. What remains open is not small. There are roles she has not yet played, productions she is developing, partnerships whose outcomes are not yet written. The critical conversation around her work is actively shifting, not because she has been rehabilitated, but because the critical framework that undervalued her has itself come under scrutiny. The morning show has continued, she has continued, and the gap between the image the world built around her and the person doing the actual work continues to be the most interesting thing about her story. She is not waiting for a final verdict. The story is still running.